sleet struck Catherine O'Brien's face in hard, needled bursts as she crossed Milsom Street with a crate of borrowed silver braced against her hip, her right arm numb from the weight, and her left hand too cold to close fully around the handle. Water had soaked through the seam of her left boot before she reached the first corner. By the second, both stockings clung to her ankles like wet paper. Her gloves had split at each fingertip 3 weeks ago, and the wool now rubbed her skin raw each time she shifted the crate to keep from dropping it. She had eaten nothing since the heel of yesterday's loaf. Hunger did not arrive as weakness any longer. It came as a tight knot under her ribs, a cramp that clenched and released in waves, as regular as church bells. Carriages rolled past her toward the upper rooms, wheels hissing through slush, and powdered footmen jumped down to lower steps for ladies in pale silk and gentlemen with polished boots. No one offered to carry the crate. 2 women paused as she passed, looked first at the silver and then at her face, and lowered their voices only enough to make cruelty sound refined. "Poor Miss O'Brien," one murmured, "plain, unfortunate, and still unchosen." The other gave the small sigh people used when they wished to be seen being kind. Such a fall, after all. Catherine kept walking. She held her shoulders level so the platters would not slide and crack. She did not look at them because looking invited apology, and apology invited conversation, and conversation cost minutes she could not afford. If one tureen arrived dented, Mrs. Holwick would deduct the repair from her wages. If she was late, Lady Norwood would call her ungrateful in front of the breakfast table. The sleet thickened. A drop slipped beneath her collar and ran down her spine. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted iron and kept her pace steady. Heel then toe, heel then toe. Each step measured against the ache in her wrists. At 22 she had the drawn, pale look fashionable ladies paid to imitate and could not sustain for more than a month. On Catherine it was not fashion but arithmetic. Too little meat, too little sleep, too many stairs climbed with coal pails after midnight. Her dark hair, once brushed loose to her waist by a mother she barely remembered, was now pinned in practical coils that loosened by noon. Her eyes looked too large in her thin face, though not from innocence. From nights spent mending cuffs by candle stubs and reading figures in ledgers until numbers doubled. She moved quickly, but never carelessly. Every tray she carried through crowded rooms was balanced, as if a verdict lay on it. In a way, one did. Lady Norwood had perfected the domestic art of making accidents moral failures. A dropped spoon became proof of ingratitude. A missed stitch became laziness. A cough became insolence. Catherine had learned that silence protected her better than argument. She had also learned that silence did not soften blows. By the time she reached Camden Place, the hem of her dress had gathered a dark line of road grit and melted sleet. She entered by the servants' door as instructed, not the front steps where she had once been led by her father's hand, and announced to callers as Miss Catherine O'Brien, daughter of Dr. O'Brien of Lansdowne Hill. That name had carried weight then. Physicians dined with magistrates. Scholars sought her father's opinion. Patients came in hired gigs at dawn and left with relief in their faces. He could read Latin without pause, quote Galen from memory, and forget entirely to send bills. Debt had come quietly, then all at once. A failed investment, a loan against the house, 2 creditors with patients, 1 without. A fever that took him in 6 days and left his papers unsorted. He had trusted his second wife to settle matters honourably. Trust had been the one diagnosis he got wrong. In the hot kitchen steam of Camden Place, Catherine polished spoons until her fingers stung, then carried tea-urns into a drawing-room heavy with perfume and coal smoke. Ladies who had known her since childhood accepted cups from her hand without meeting her eye. A colonel's widow asked for more sugar, then looked startled when Catherine answered in French by reflex to a phrase spoken beside her. The woman blinked, recovered, and smiled as if at a performing dog. "How useful," she said to the room. "Lady Norwood keeps educated help." A small laugh travelled over porcelain. Catherine lowered the teapot and moved on. She could feel the skin between her shoulder blades tighten, the body's old warning that shame had entered before anger. Anger was dangerous. Shame was survivable. She chose survival, poured another cup, and kept count of saucers so none would be missing when she returned the crate. Near noon, Lady Norwood's footman appeared in the passage to summon her back to Norwood House. He did not need to raise his voice. "Her ladyship says you are to come at once. The florist has made an error with the centrepieces. Miss Lydia is in tears." Miss Lydia cried over wilted peonies, crooked hems, rain spots on satin, and any mirror that reflected another woman in the room. Catherine handed over the inventory sheet, signed for the borrowed silver, and walked back through streets that smelled of wet horse and chimney soot. The sleet had turned to rain, finer now but colder, and each drop found the gap at her cuffs. By the time she reached the back gate, her fingers had swollen enough that she could not untie her apron without using her teeth. Norwood House rose from the hill in grey stone and narrow windows, too large for the people who lived in it, and too dim to look inhabited. It had belonged to her father. Then it had belonged to the bank. Then, through legal turns she had not been allowed to witness, it had belonged to Lady Norwood in trust. The portrait of Catherine's mother had vanished first. The walnut desk from the surgery went next. The final blow had been the nursery clock, sold to cover household necessities. The weak Lady Norwood purchased 3 new gowns in lion silk. She found Lady Norwood in the blue sitting-room, where the curtains were drawn against the weather, and the scent of rosewater sat thick in the air. Violet silk rustled when she turned. Even in private she dressed as if for inspection. Her 2 daughters, Lydia and Anne, perched beside the fire in cream muslin, pale hands extended to the heat Catherine had earned, carrying logs before dawn. "You are wetting the carpet," Lady Norwood said, without greeting. "Stand by the door." Catherine stepped back onto the tile border. "The Kettering party arrives at 6. You will press Lydia's evening gown, alter Anne's sleeves, and then lay the supper sideboard. After guests depart, coal to all second-floor grates, the nursery hearth as well. Mrs. Davies says you neglected it yesterday." "I filled it at 11, my lady." Lady Norwood's gaze sharpened, not loud but cutting. "Are you correcting me?" "No, my lady." "Then do not argue. You forget your place with alarming frequency for a dependent." Lydia glanced up, lips curving. "Do send her to dance at the door tonight, Mamma. Mrs. Vale asked if the thin one still lives here." Anne laughed behind her glove. "She means to pity her again. It is practically tradition." Lady Norwood allowed herself a measured smile. "Pity is often the only currency some women attract." The words landed with the lightness of practised cruelty, delivered in the tone other women used for weather. Catherine felt the familiar burn rise to her throat. She swallowed it. She inclined her head and took the folded gown from Lydia's lap, careful not to brush the girl's hand. One touch and she would hear about contamination, insolence, impertinence. The rules shifted daily. The punishments did not. That afternoon passed in heat and pins. She stood over the pressing board until steam dampened her hairline and soaked the bodice of her plain brown dress. She narrowed Anne's sleeves by 1/2 an inch each and re-sewed pearl buttons with thread fine as hair. She carried trays up and down stairs built for men with longer legs and stronger lungs. At dusk she lit candles in the front hall, while rain beat against the fan light in thin, relentless taps. Guests arrived wrapped in wool and gossip. She took umbrellas and cloaks, announced names to a butler who outranked her by station, if not by memory, and bowed her head as familiar faces looked through her. 2 matrons discussed her within arm's reach. She had prospects once. Indeed, but no dowry now, and that look of fatigue. Men want brightness. A gentleman answered softly, not unkindly. One cannot marry everyone one pities. They moved on before she could hand over his hat. By the 2nd week of June, the season's gatherings had begun to blur into one long room of candlelight and appraisal. The pattern never altered. Lady Norwood displayed polish. Her daughters displayed charm. Catherine displayed usefulness. At supper she remained in the side passage, carrying platters from kitchen to dining room, inhaling roasted pheasant and buttered carrots she would not taste. Later she ate crusts beside the scullery sink, standing because sitting would mean not rising again when called. Past midnight she hauled coal to the upper grates, one black scuttle at a time, the iron rim digging a crescent into her palm through damp cloth. On the 3rd trip her knee buckled on the landing. She caught herself against the wall before the scuttle tipped and blacked the carpet. She breathed once, twice, until the room stopped tilting, then lifted again and climbed. When the house finally stilled, she mounted the narrow stairs to the attic room that had once stored trunks and now stored her. Rain ticked against the sloped roof. Wind moved through the cracked window frame and cooled the sweat at the back of her neck into shivers. Her bed was a rope frame with a mattress thin enough that she felt each slat. Her blankets smelled faintly of old smoke and lavender starch. She closed the door, set the candle on an upturned crate, and knelt beside the sewing basket pushed under the bed. Beneath folded mending and a torn petticoat lay the notebook wrapped in linen. Her father's hand copied in her own, page after page of symptoms, tinctures, fracture settings, fever charts, practical mercy pressed into neat columns. She opened to a section on winter agues and held the candle close until the ink darkened. The cramps in her stomach had sharpened into a dull, steady pull. Her fingertips were split and rough. Her eyes burned with smoke and weariness. Still she read, lips moving silently over each line, taking back in secret what had been stripped from her in public, while below her Lady Norwood's house slept warm on coal Catherine had carried. She turned another page, and the paper gave its dry whisper in the small room, as if it feared to wake the house below. The candle flame dipped when wind found the cracked frame, then righted itself, and her father's careful headings, catarrh, ague, fracture of radius, stood in black lines above her own copied script, neat from habit and necessity, while her hand shook with fatigue enough to make the letters blur. She pressed her thumb into the margin until the tremor settled, and saw, beneath the notation on fever pulse, a stain shaped like a crescent moon, where rain had once touched the ink on the morning she carried his casebook across the garden from surgery to hall, and found him at the base of the study stairs with one hand clenched at his chest, eyes open, breath short, saying her name not with panic, but apology. "The ledger," he had said first, absurdly, because numbers still seemed solvable to him then. "Top drawer, do not let Norwood take the blue folio until Mr. Pike has recalculated." He had been a physician to the bone, issuing instruction through pain, as if instruction itself might hold his body together. She had knelt on the tiles and called for help until the house answered at last with too many feet and too little speed. He had lived 6 more days. On the 4th, when the fever turned his skin wax pale and his eyes too bright, he asked for soup and could not swallow. On the 5th, he mistook the nurse for his first wife and smiled with such tenderness that Catherine had to step into the corridor to breathe. On the 6th, he was lucid long enough to find her wrist and fit 2 fingers where pulse beat under skin. "Steady," he whispered. "You have my hands. Use them kindly. Never ask permission to do what is necessary." The words remained lodged in her like a shard she couldn't remove. They had carried her through scalded fingers, winter errands, nights on the attic mattress, listening to laughter below. They had also made grief practical, and practical grief was crueler than tears. After the funeral, she had discovered his bills, his notes, the letters from creditors folded beneath journals on anatomy, each one increasingly formal, each one granting 1 more month, 1 more extension, 1 more warning written in polite language that still meant seizure. 3 men were owed. 2 had signed agreements for delayed payment against future patient fees. The 3rd had demanded immediate settlement and attached the house. Her father had answered with promises, then with silence, and finally with the trust deed that placed temporary authority in his widow's hands until debts were discharged. Temporary. The word had looked merciful in legal ink. She knew now it could be sharpened into a blade. Lady Norwood had entered that authority like a woman entering a warmed carriage, without haste, and without doubt, and within 48 hours the house had acquired new rules spoken in a low voice that never rose because it never needed to. Catherine could still see the morning room after the mourners left. Black crepe tied to door handles, untouched cakes gone stale on silver stands, rain making pale ropes down the glass, and Lady Norwood at the escritoire in deep violet despite the season, rose-water scent cutting through beeswax and funeral lilies, while she sorted papers into 3 piles, assets, obligations, disposal, with Lydia and Anne leaning over her shoulders like attentive pupils at recitation. "You will not concern yourself with accounts," she had told Catherine then, not looking up. "You have no head for figures. Your father indulged your odd studies. I will not." Catherine had answered before caution caught her. "He taught me double entry when I was 13. Lady Norwood had set down the pen with slow precision and raised her eyes, the same look she gave now when preparing to strike without lifting a hand. "Then he failed you in judgment as well as in economy. You will address me as my lady in this house, and you will remember that charity has replaced entitlement." Charity. The word had burned more than accusation because it rewrote history in a single stroke. Her mother had died when Catherine was 7, leaving a shawl, a lullaby, and a silver-backed brush with 1 missing tooth. Her father remarried 2 years later, a practical arrangement people called sensible. A widower with a daughter and a practice, a widow with social polish, and 2 pretty girls. At first, Lady Norwood had been all measured kindness before company and cool distance after supper. She corrected table posture. She chose ribbons. She praised Catherine's handwriting when guests could hear. Only after the trust deed was sealed did performance become policy. Doors that had always stood open were locked. The blue folio vanished. The pantry key moved to Lady Norwood's chatelaine. Coal usage was recorded against names. Linen was inventoried and reassigned. Catherine's room was changed from the west chamber overlooking the lime trees to the attic under pretext of drafts and repairs, though no repairs were ever undertaken. "The upper room is appropriate," Lady Norwood said, while footmen carried trunks past her, not one of them containing her own books, because those had already been boxed for sale with the medical journals. "You are no longer receiving callers." When Catherine asked where her mother's portrait had gone, Lady Norwood touched the edge of her sleeve, as if soothing a child. "Do not be theatrical. We have obligations to meet. Sentiment does not satisfy creditors." Yet the same week, a crate arrived from London containing new draperies for the blue sitting room and a set of French porcelain figurines Lydia admired. Catherine saw the invoice. She saw the seal. She saw the amount larger than the quarter's wages for every servant combined. She said nothing, because her silence was the only coin that still bought her access to corners of truth. Lydia and Anne learned quickly what power looked like when exercised downward, and they wore it as naturally as silk. The first thing they took was trivial to anyone else and unbearable to her. A worn green ribbon from her mother's workbox, claimed by Anne with a laugh and threaded through her own hair because it suits me better than morning colours. The second was not trivial. Lydia appeared at dinner in Catherine's winter mantle, altered at the shoulders, and spun once before the mirror so the fur edging flashed in candlelight. "You are too slight for it now," she said when Catherine stared, voice bright with practised innocence. "Mamma said it should not go to waste." It was the mantle her father had wrapped around Catherine after skating when she was 12, telling her she looked like a scholar pretending to be an heiress. She stood through soup in a thin wool shawl and answered when spoken to in the same tone she used to announce tea. Soon after, both sisters took possession of the music room afternoons. Though Catherine had practised there since childhood, on a square pianoforte, now missing 2 keys. They did not play well, but they played loudly, then called her to turn pages and fetch water while guests praised their accomplishment. At assemblies the pattern hardened into ritual humiliation. Lady Norwood would arrive at the upper rooms in peacock silk with her daughters floating beside her, then pause just long enough in each conversation circle to say, "My dependent daughter assists us now. Poor thing! She has no fortune but a diligent disposition." Faces would soften, heads would tilt. Someone would say how worthy. Someone else would say how tragic. And Catherine, standing with tray in hand, would feel pity move through the room like a draught no one acknowledged. It did not feed her. It did not return her books. It did not stop Lady Norwood from striking her once in the linen passage, when a cuff remained damp, open palm to cheek, quick and clean, then ordering her to smile before entering the dining room. "You bruise so readily," Lady Norwood had said afterward, almost curious. "One would think your skin wished to accuse me." The bruise bloomed beneath her ear by evening. In front of guests, Lady Norwood touched the same place with a gloved finger and laughed softly. "Miss O'Brien is forever walking into cupboard doors." The room supplied the expected murmur. No one contradicted her. Catherine learned to angle her hair lower, to pin it over discoloration, to keep her collar high even by kitchen heat. Over time she learned which servants would look away out of mercy and which would report every pause as insolence. What cut deepest was that being called plain did not wound as deeply as being called fortunate to be tolerated. Now, in the attic, the notebook lay open across her knees while rain tapped and tapped above the slates, and the whole inventory of those years sat inside her body, as if each slight had weight and shape. The ache in her right shoulder from coal scuttles, the line of old scar at her thumb where a cracked basin sliced skin, the faint ridge behind her left wrist where Lady Norwood's bracelet clasp caught when she yanked Catherine back from the front door in front of the Vales and hissed, "Dependents do not receive guests." She reached beneath the notebook and drew out folded papers she kept hidden there, copied by candlelight from documents left carelessly on the study desk after Lady Norwood dismissed clerks, debt schedules, sale notices, a transfer order bearing her father's signature on page 1, and an added codicil in another hand on page 3. She had traced each loop and slash until she knew the difference between ink laid down in steady health and ink pressed by a hand that shook. She could not prove fraud in a room full of people who preferred comfort to truth, but she could feel the irregularity the way a physician felt bone set wrongly under skin. If she survived long enough, if she gathered enough copies, if a magistrate one day read without deference to silk, perhaps the word temporary might recover its meaning. The thought was thin shelter, yet it was shelter. She folded the papers back into linen and slid them beneath the mattress slat, where rope crossed wood. Downstairs a door closed. Floorboards answered in a slow sequence she knew by heart. Mrs. Davies in soft shoes, then the butler's heavier tread, then stillness, then, after a pause, the sharper, impatient rhythm of Lady Norwood crossing the landing toward the rear staircase. Catherine pinched out the candle, and darkness took the room at once, cold and immediate, while she sat upright on the narrow bed with the notebook clutched to her chest, and listened to those steps climb one flight, then another, and stop outside her door. The latch lifted without a knock, and Lady Norwood entered with a candle held high, violet silk whispering against the frame while rose water pushed into the cold attic air, as if scent itself were authority. Catherine had no time to hide the notebook. She drew it closer instead, palms flat over the linen cover, and sat very still on the narrow bed while Lady Norwood's eyes moved once around the room, taking in the extinguished wick, the cracked basin, the patched hem drying on a chair, the absence of anything worth stealing. "You sat in darkness," Lady Norwood said. "How dramatic!" "The candle was spent, my lady." Lady Norwood stepped nearer. The candlelight sharpened every angle of her face and cast Catherine's shadow long across the floorboards. "You will not play the martyr in this house. Dress! You are going out." "At this hour?" "At this necessity." She produced a folded paper from the sleeve of her gown and held it out without releasing it. "Mrs. Pembroke's milliner has ruined Lydia's walking dress. You will take the corrected hem pieces to Argyle Lane before dawn, and return with the altered bodice before noon. You will also collect the silver epergne from Halwick's rooms. If you fail in either task, do not trouble to come through the front gate." Rain struck the slates above them in hard bursts. Catherine could feel exhaustion in her bones, a deep ache behind the knees and at the base of her skull. But she reached for the paper. Lady Norwood kept her grip. "You will stop at Mr. Pike's office on your return," she added. "You will deliver this second note and wait for his receipt." Catherine looked up. "I am not permitted in his office." "You are permitted where I send you." Lady Norwood released the first paper, then set a sealed envelope on the bed. The wax carried the Norwood crest. "Do not pry. Do not delay. Do not speak of household matters." She turned toward the door, then paused and looked back, gaze dropping to the notebook beneath Catherine's hands. "You still cling to that physician's drudge work. Burn it. There is no use in preserving fantasies of importance." Catherine's throat tightened, but her voice remained level. "My father wrote those pages." Lady Norwood's mouth curved. Not quite a smile. "Your father signed many pages, most of them costly." She moved into the corridor. "You leave in 20 minutes." The door shut. The lock did not turn, yet the sound still carried the weight of confinement. Catherine sat for one long breath, then rose. Her fingers were stiff as she pulled on damp stockings and forced her feet into boots that had not dried. She wrapped the notebook in linen, slid it beneath the mattress slat, and tucked the copied debt papers under it with precise care. If Lady Norwood chose to search while she was gone, discovery would mean more than punishment. It would mean erasure. She pinned her hair, took the 2 notes, and descended the rear stair in darkness, because no candle had been left for her. In the kitchen passage, Mrs. Davies stood by the cold hearth with a shawl over her nightdress, waiting as though she had known the order before it was spoken. The housekeeper pressed half a heel of bread into Catherine's palm and looked once toward the door. "Eat on the road," she whispered, "and keep to the lower lane. The upper stones are glass in this weather." "Thank you." Mrs. Davies touched Catherine's wrist, light as moth wings. "If her ladyship asks, I said nothing." Catherine nodded and stepped into pre-dawn rain that had turned from sleet to a thin, relentless sheet. The street lamps burned low and far apart. Water ran in black ribbons along the cobbles. She held the hem packet under her cloak and walked fast through empty crescents where great houses watched with shuttered windows, and no witness wanted to be awake. Hunger twisted hard enough to bend her for a moment beneath an archway. She forced herself upright and ate the bread in 2 bites, swallowing before her body could decide it was not enough. By the time the first grey lifted over the Abbey Tower, she had delivered the milliner's bundle and taken back the promised bodice, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with strings she did not trust. The borrowing clerk at Halwick's received her with a yawn, made her sign for the epergne in a ledger blotched with old wax, and warned that any dent would be charged at replacement value. She lifted the crate to her hip, gripped the bodice parcel beneath one arm, and began the return toward Lansdowne with rain driving slantwise and wind slicing through wet seams. At the corner near St. James's Parade, a hack carriage splashed past and threw muddy water to her knees. A shop boy laughed from under an awning. She did not break stride. She had just turned into the lower lane Mrs. Davies named, when the world in front of her split open with sound. Horses screamed. Iron struck stone. A wheel cracked with a report like gunfire. The dark travel carriage careened sideways, clipped a post, and slammed to a halt at an angle that wrenched both traces taut. One horse reared. The other went down to its knees, thrashing. A groom shouted and lost his footing. The carriage door burst outward, then swung back and struck the frame. Catherine dropped the silver crate where she stood and ran. A man in a dark greatcoat came down from the carriage steps, with blood at his temple, one gloved hand braced to the door, his stance too controlled for a man who had just been thrown. Beside the near wheel, another gentleman lay twisted in the mud, breathing in short, shocked pulls, his right leg bent at an angle no leg should keep. A coachman cursed and tugged uselessly at the bridle. Rain hit all of them in cold, hard lines. "Stay back!" the tall man snapped, his voice cut through hooves and weather like a blade. "Leave him! My men will do it!" Catherine was already on her knees at the injured man's side, cloak soaking through at once, fingers finding the pulse at his throat, then the line of the broken limb. "Your men are with the horses. I gave you an order." "And I heard it!" She tore her own shawl from her shoulders and folded it beneath the injured man's head before mud could choke him. "Hold still, sir. Breathe with me, slowly." The wounded man made a sound between a groan and a laugh. "That appears to be beyond my present talents." She looked up once at the tall stranger. Rain tracked over a face carved hard by restraint, dark hair plastered at the temples, jaw set as if pain were an insult. He had not moved from her shoulder's reach. His hand, the one not braced to the carriage, had gone white at the knuckles. There was authority in every line of him, and fury, and an iron refusal to show weakness before witnesses. "Lantern," she said. He stared as if no one had addressed him in that tone for years. "Lantern, sir. I cannot set this blind." For one beat she thought he would drag her away by the arm. Instead he turned, seized the swinging carriage lantern from its hook, and brought it down into the rain so the light fell across the injured leg. Mud, torn wool, swelling at the shin, closed break, likely tibia, severe but survivable if not moved wrongly. The coachman had managed to steady one horse. 2 passing porters stopped and caught the other's bridle. A woman cried out from a doorway and crossed herself. The injured man tried to sit and nearly fainted. Catherine pressed him back. "Do not move. Look at me." She took his wrist. "Tell me your name." "Mr. Hale," he gasped. "Steward to—" "Good. Mr. Hale, you are not dying. You are hurt and cold. That is all. I need splints." She looked to the tall man again. "The crate. There." He followed her gaze to the dropped silver box, crossed the mud in 3 long strides, and ripped free 2 wooden slats from its side with blunt force that spoke of temper held on a leash. He came back and handed them to her without comment. Up close, his eyes were grey, not pale, but storm-dark, and there was a scar high at his left brow she would have missed in gentler light. "On my count," she said, "you hold his shoulders. I do not take instruction from strangers." "Then call your surgeon and watch him lose the leg by morning." The words hung between them, rain beating time around the silence. His mouth hardened. Then he knelt in the mud opposite her and set one hand firm across Mr. Hale's chest. "Count!" he said. She did. The injured man cried out once when the bone shifted back into line. Catherine bound the makeshift splints with shawl strips, knotted tight, checked circulation at the ankle, loosened, retied. Her hands stayed steady until the final knot. Only then did tremor run through her fingers so sharply she had to clench them once before she could release the cloth. Boots pounded up the lane. 2 mounted outriders dismounted in practiced motion, one taking the horses, the other coming straight toward the kneeling man and stopping dead when he saw Catherine. "Your Grace!" The title struck harder than sleet. Catherine looked from the outrider to the man beside her and felt the power imbalance settle over the scene with cold, immediate precision. Everyone in Bath knew the name even when they pretended not to speak it. The Duke of Renford, widowed by rumour, unsoftened by it. A man whose household ran like a regiment and whose displeasure could freeze a room faster than winter glass. She drew back a fraction and bent her head. "Your Grace." He did not acknowledge the formality. He was looking at her cuff, where rain had darkened fabric enough to reveal a yellowing bruise at the wrist and another, fresher mark along the forearm. His gaze moved once to her split glove, then to the bloodless line of her mouth. "You are shaking," he said. "It is rain, sir." "Liar!" The word was quiet, worse for being quiet. "You are not clumsy. Someone strikes you." Heat rose to her face despite the cold. The outrider looked away at once, as did the coachman. Public shame could be survived. Being named accurately in public was more dangerous. She reached for the displaced crate slats to give her hands occupation. "Mr. Hale needs dry heat and elevation," she said. "No journey beyond an inn until swelling is watched." "We will take him to the Crown posting house," the outrider said. The Duke rose and offered no hand. He simply stood over the scene, rain slicking his coat to broad shoulders, blood at his temple now diluted to a dark track near his collar. "You will come," he said to Catherine. "My lady expects me home with these deliveries." His gaze did not shift. "You will come." "I am not in your service, Your Grace." His expression did not change, yet something in it sharpened, not anger this time, but decision. "You set his leg in a storm with crate wood and torn wool. You will see it held. That is not a request." A Norwood footman appeared at the lane's mouth as if summoned by malice itself, breathless, hat askew, livery splashed with mud. He pointed at Catherine before he had fully stopped. "There you are. Her ladyship says you are to return at once. At once, do you hear? You have delayed 3 hours." Catherine stood slowly, rain running from her hem in steady streams. The footman glanced at the Duke, recognised rank, and blanched, but duty or fear carried him on. "She is needed at Norwood House, Your Grace. Household orders." The Duke turned his head by inches. "Who gave you leave to speak in my lane?" The footman swallowed. "No one, Your Grace. I was sent for Miss O'Brien." The Duke stepped closer until the man retreated half a pace without seeming to choose it. "Miss O'Brien is attending my injured steward. Inform Lady Norwood that I will account for her absence." The footman opened and shut his mouth. "My lady will not receive that kindly." "Then she may practice receiving it now." The man bowed too quickly, nearly slipped, and backed away with all the haste etiquette allowed. Catherine watched him go, dread settling in her stomach with familiar weight. Lady Norwood would make this debt costly. She could already hear the words waiting at the top of the rear stairs. The Duke looked down at her again. Rain traced the ridge of the scar by his brow. "Can he be moved?" "Yes, with care. Keep the leg straight. Do not let him stand." He gave a single nod to his men. They lifted Mr. Hale onto a doorboard pulled from the carriage boot and carried him toward the waiting coach. Catherine bent to retrieve the bodice parcel, now soaked through, and the split silver crate she would surely be charged for. The Duke took the crate from her hand and passed it to an outrider without breaking stride. "Leave that! It is borrowed. I will replace 10. That is not the point." His eyes held hers for a long moment, unreadable as slate. Then, to the coachman, "Open the door." He gestured once toward the carriage interior, command stripped to its bone. "Inside, Miss O'Brien." She climbed in because refusal would not save her, and because Mr. Hale's breathing had gone thin again as the board jolted, and because her father had taught her to go where necessity called before fear finished speaking. The Duke entered after her and shut the door against the rain. The carriage lurched forward at once, wheels striking ruts hard enough to jar bone. Mr. Hale lay stretched along the opposite bench with his head in Catherine's lap, because there was nowhere else to put him. His breath fast and shallow, his gloved hands clenched against the pain in his leg. The Duke sat facing them, knees braced, one hand gripping the leather strap above the window, while the other held the carriage lantern low so she could keep watch on the steward's colour. "Keep him awake," she said. The Duke gave a short nod. "Hale, look at me." Mr. Hale opened his eyes with effort. Rainwater tracked through his hair and down into his collar. "I am trying, Your Grace." "Try harder." Catherine slid 2 fingers to the pulse at his throat. Too quick, thready. She shifted the folded oilcloth parcel beneath his broken leg to keep the splints from knocking against wood each time the carriage swayed. Every movement drew a tight sound from him, swallowed at once as if apology were expected of men in pain. "Do not apologise," she said quietly. "Breathe deep and slow, in for 4 counts, out for 4. His jaw worked. He obeyed. Across from her the Duke watched her hands. Not her face, not the steward. Her hands chapped and red and steady, now only by force. Blood from his temple had dried in a dark line toward his collar. He had not touched it once. By the time they reached the Crown posting house, dawn had thinned the sky to dirty pearl. Stable boys ran to the horses. A porter shouted for blankets. The inn door opened to light and heat and the smell of coal, wet wool, and stale ale. Men turned to stare when they saw the Duke step down first and then reach back, not to assist her, but to take the lantern so she could guide the board. "Straight!" she ordered as the outriders lifted Mr. Hale out. "Keep the leg aligned. Do not hurry because you are frightened." No one argued. Even the innkeeper, red-faced and half-dressed, moved where she pointed. They carried the steward through a narrow passage into a private parlour with a small grate and a long table pushed against the wall. Rain hammered the panes. Mud spread across polished boards in dark prints. "Hot water, clean linen, more light," Catherine said, "and send for a surgeon who has set more than noses." The innkeeper blinked at the tone, then looked to the Duke. "Do it," the Duke said. 2 maids rushed in with basins. Catherine stripped off her soaked gloves and set to work before the water had fully steamed. She checked the splint ties, loosened one to restore warmth to the foot, retied, then cut away the lower leg of Mr. Hale's ruined trousers with sewing scissors pulled from her work pocket. The skin beneath was already swelling. No open wound. Thank God. She pressed along the shin with careful fingers. Alignment held. "Pain here?" she asked. "Mister." Hale nodded once, sweat beading at his lip despite the cold. "Here?" A shake of the head. She looked up at the outrider nearest the fire. "Warm bricks wrapped in flannel, not direct heat. If you scorch him, I will set your hand next." The man stared, then did exactly as told. The Duke remained by the door, broad shoulders filling the frame, wet coat still on, boots leaving small pools on the floorboards. He looked like a carved figure set there to keep the room from tipping into panic. Yet twice, when Mr. Hale's eyes rolled back, Catherine saw the muscle in his jaw flex as if he had bitten down on steel. "You are concussed," she said to him, without lifting her head from the knot she was tying. "Sit before you fall." "I do not fall. Everyone falls." His mouth tightened. "Attend your patient." "I have too." For a heartbeat, the room stilled. Then, from the table, Mr. Hale made a strained sound that was almost a laugh and then became a groan. Catherine leaned over him again, hand at his shoulder. "Stay with me, Mr. Hale. Tell me what month it is." "June," he whispered. "Good. Your surname?" "Hale." "Your employer?" His gaze drifted toward the doorway. "A tyrant on difficult mornings." One corner of the Duke's mouth moved. Not quite a smile. He stepped into the room at last and stripped off his gloves with slow precision. 3 days earlier, Catherine would have called the motion elegant. Now she saw what elegance concealed. His right hand shook very slightly once the gloves were gone. The surgeon arrived 20 minutes later in a coat thrown over his nightshirt, hair unpowdered, medical case banging against his knee. He smelled of clove and wine. He bowed to the Duke, glanced at Catherine kneeling at the table, and frowned as if she were a misplaced chair. "You have had him moved already," he said. "Who manipulated the fracture?" "I did," Catherine answered. The surgeon's brows rose. "And you are?" "No one relevant," the Duke said before she could. "Examine him." The surgeon set his fingers to the leg, prodded, hummed, and finally gave one brisk nod. "Set well enough, though I would have bled him first." "No," Catherine said. The surgeon turned, affronted. "Madame, if you wish to practice in taverns, you may do so after I leave." "Bleeding him in shock would drop his pressure further. He is cold already, pulse weak. Warmth and fluids first." He gave a short, incredulous laugh. "Fluids! We are not nursing a wilted fern." From the doorway the Duke said, very quietly, "You were summoned to treat my steward, not to lecture mine." The surgeon's face altered at once. "Of course, Your Grace." He reached again for the case. This time he took out willow bark and laudanum. not the lancet. Catherine said nothing. She held the cup while Mr. Hale swallowed in measured sips. When the surgeon had finished binding and pronouncing, and when he had repeated his instructions directly to the Duke as if she were furniture, Catherine asked 2 precise questions about swelling thresholds and fever onset. He answered both without meeting her eye, then left with his fee and his dignity half intact. Only after the door closed did Catherine realise how violently her hands were trembling. She set them against the table edge until the tremor eased. Hunger had become a hard hollow beneath her ribs. Her wet dress clung to her back and sleeves. Her hair had worked loose at the temples. She felt each pulse beat in her cracked fingertips. A maid appeared with broth she had not asked for, and held it out uncertainly. Catherine shook her head. For him. The maid glanced at Mr. Hale, then at Catherine's face. There is enough for 2, miss. For him first. The Duke had moved to the window. Rain streaked the glass in slanted lines. Without turning, he said, Bring a second bowl. The maid fled and returned with another. Catherine took it only because refusal in front of servants would become another battle. She drank 3 spoonfuls standing up and felt heat strike her empty stomach like pain. She lowered the spoon and set the bowl aside. In the passage outside, raised voices began, muffled by doors but sharp with urgency. Catherine knew the cadence before she caught the words. Norwood livery carried a particular rhythm of obedience and fear. A knock came. One of the Duke's men opened without waiting and admitted the same Norwood footman from the lane, now drier but no less pale. He held a folded note at arm's length as if it might burn him. For Miss O'Brien, he said, from Lady Norwood. Catherine took it. The seal was fresh. She did not want to break it while everyone watched. She broke it anyway. Return immediately. You have abandoned assigned duty, damaged borrowed property, and caused public scene. If you fail to present yourself within the hour, your room will be cleared and your effects disposed of. Mr. Pike has been informed of your instability. No signature, none needed. She folded the note once, twice, until the edges were exact. She felt no surprise, only a familiar narrowing in the chest, as if the body made itself smaller to endure the expected blow. The footman cleared his throat. Her ladyship said I am to escort you back now, miss. Mr. Hale stirred on the table and made a low sound through his teeth as the drug wore thin. Catherine looked at him, then at the footman. Tell her ladyship I am with an injured man. I told her that before, miss. She said no decent woman remains at an inn in company not her own. The sentence landed in the room like dirty water. One outrider swore under his breath. The maid by the hearth went crimson and stared at the floor. Catherine felt shame rise hot under her wet skin, not because the accusation held truth, but because truth had never been required to ruin a woman. The Duke spoke from across the room. Your message is delivered. Leave. The footman swallowed and did not move. Your Grace, my orders are... Revised? The Duke took one step forward. Leave. The man bowed and fled. Silence followed. Coal shifted in the grate with a dry crack. Rain continued at the window. Catherine kept her eyes on the folded note in her hand because looking at anyone would mean feeling too much at once. Mr. Hale opened his eyes and found her face. Do not go yet, he whispered. I cannot keep the room level when you're not speaking. She leaned closer at once. The room is level. You're safe. Listen to my voice. He obeyed, breath by breath. She stayed through the next hour. Then the next. She counted pulse and colour and warmth. She adjusted splints when swelling pressed the ties. She coaxed broth into him and kept him from sleeping too deeply until concussion signs eased. She sent for more blankets, then removed one when heat climbed too fast. She wrote the surgeon's dose intervals on the back of Lady Norwood's note and pinned it to the table leg where no one could pretend forgetfulness later. The Duke came and went without announcement. Once she saw him in the corridor speaking low to a messenger in Renford colours, wax seal pressed into the man's hand with instructions too soft to catch. Once she glanced up and found him standing just beyond the half-open parlour door, motionless, watching while she rubbed warmth back into Mr. Hale's cold fingers. She looked down at once, assuming he would enter and issue another order. He did not. When she checked again, the corridor was empty. By late morning the rain had eased to a fine mist. Light gathered weakly in the window panes. Mr. Hale slept naturally at last, pulse slower, breath deeper. Catherine sank onto a straight-backed chair near the hearth, and only then felt what her body had been postponing. Exhaustion came like weight dropped from height. Her shoulders burned. Her knee throbbed where she had knelt in the lane. Her boots had rubbed both heels raw. She pressed her thumb hard into the centre of her palm to keep herself alert. The maid returned with a tray and lingered this time. "Miss, there is a gentleman in the common room asking for the physician lady who set the steward's leg." Catherine blinked. "I am not a physician. That is not what they are calling you. Names could be gifts. Names could be traps." She stood anyway and stepped into the passage. A carter with a bandaged hand waited there, cap in both hands, eyes fixed on the floorboards. "Beg pardon, miss. The ostler said you helped the gentleman from the crash. I split this on an axle chain at dawn. Surgeon told me to wait till tomorrow. It is throbbing fit to crack." Catherine should have said no. She had no authority here, no licence, no protection. Lady Norwood's note was still tucked in her pocket like a threat with edges. Yet the man's hand was swollen and badly wrapped, and tomorrow was a long way off for someone in pain. "Sit," she said. She cleaned the wound at the scullery pump with boiled water and salt, removed grit with tweezers borrowed from the maid's sewing roll, and rewrapped the palm so he could flex 2 fingers without tearing the skin. The man hissed once, then let out a breath that sounded like relief and grief together. "What do I owe?" he asked. "Nothing," he stared. "Nothing. Bring clean cloth tomorrow for a new wrap. Keep it dry tonight." He nodded too many times, backed away, and nearly collided with the Duke at the corridor turn. Catherine had not heard him approach. He stood with one hand braced to the wall, temple bruise dark now against skin gone too pale. His gaze moved from the departing carter to the basin, to the blood-tinged water, to her hands. "You were told to rest," he said. "You were told to sit." He looked at her for a long moment, then at the wrap on the carter's hand disappearing down the hall. "You treat strangers for free while your own house threatens to throw you into the street." "Yes." "Why?" She rinsed the cloth once more, wrung it out, and set it to dry. "Because pain does not pause for my circumstances." Something in his face changed, too slight for anyone not watching. The hard line of command remained. The cold remained. Yet, beneath both, for one brief, unguarded instant, she saw recognition. Not pity, not approval. Recognition as sharp and unsparing as his earlier accusation. From the parlour came Mr. Hale's hoarse call, disoriented by waking. Catherine turned toward it at once. "I am coming," she said. She crossed the threshold and went to the table before anyone else could, unaware that the Duke stopped in the corridor and remained there, silent and still, listening to her steady voice as she guided his steward back from pain again. Mr. Hale's eyes were open and unfocused when she reached him, his fingers clawing weakly at the blanket, as if he were drowning beneath it. Catherine set her hand over his wrist and leaned close enough that he could fix on her face. "You are at the Crown Posting House," she said. "Your leg is set. You are warm. There was no second collision." His breathing hitched, then slowed by a fraction. "I dreamed the wheel broke again." "It did not. Listen to me. In for 4 counts. Out for 4. He followed her count with stubborn concentration, jaw tight, sweat cooling at his temples. She checked the splints once more, touched his ankle, watched colour return after pressure, then adjusted the folded blanket under his heel so the weight did not drag. Every motion cost effort now. Her shoulders burned. The small muscles in her hands fluttered with fatigue like trapped birds. In the corridor, the Duke did not move. She could feel his presence through the half-open door with the same certainty she felt heat from the grate. He stood where she had left him, one hand against the panelling, listening as though each change in Hale's breath was a number in an account he meant to settle precisely. Servants passed and lowered their voices. No one asked why he remained there when there were messages to send and horses to inspect and damage to tally. No one asked him anything at all. "Water," Mr. Hale whispered. She lifted the cup to his mouth and held it steady while he drank in small, careful swallows. He swallowed once too quickly and coughed. She waited until the spasm passed, then wiped the rim and set the cup down. "Better? Less bad," he said, and managed the faintest ghost of humour. "Do not tell His Grace I said so. He values discipline over optimism." "He values your pulse at this moment." Mr. Hale's eyes shifted toward the door where the Duke's shadow cut a dark angle on the floorboards. "He values both." Catherine tightened the blanket at Hale's shoulder and rose, knees protesting. She took one step toward the washstand, and the room tilted. Not enough to fall, enough to warn. She steadied herself on the chair back until the dizziness passed. A low voice came from the doorway. "Sit." She turned. The Duke stood framed by corridor light, coat removed at last, waistcoat dark with rain that had dried in uneven marks. The bruise at his temple had spread into a deep violet arc. He looked no less severe for the injury. If anything, the damage hardened him further, as though his body had adapted itself to pain years ago and no longer expected permission to bear it. "I am standing," she said. "You are swaying." "I can still work." "You will sit." The command struck the room and held. Catherine felt her back stiffen on instinct. Orders had ruled her life for 5 years, some petty, some cruel, nearly all designed to remind her where she stood. Defiance had cost her before. Compliance had cost her too. "Mr. Hale is awake," she said. "He may panic again." "I am awake enough to obey 2 people at once," Hale murmured, voice frayed but dry. "Miss O'Brien, if you collapse on my unbroken leg, I will resent you forever." Against her will, the corner of her mouth moved. She took the straight-backed chair by the hearth, every muscle in her thighs trembling with relief and humiliation in equal measure. She had not wanted witness to that weakness. The Duke watched until she was fully seated, then stepped inside and closed the door with measured care. "Eat," he said to a maid waiting in the passage. Within a minute, bread and broth were set on a side table near Catherine's elbow. She did not touch either. The Duke noticed. His gaze moved from the untouched tray to her hands, where the skin at each knuckle was split and white from repeated washing in harsh water. "You have had 6 spoonfuls since dawn," he said. She stared at him. "You counted." "I observe." The words were plain. No softness, no apology. They unsettled her more than pity ever had. Pity skimmed surfaces. Observation entered and remained. She forced herself to lift the spoon. The broth had formed a thin skin in the cool air. She swallowed once, twice. The knot under her ribs eased by degrees so small she would not have noticed had she not been trained to notice every symptom, every shift. Across the room, Mr. Hale watched with heavy-lidded satisfaction and let his head sink deeper into the pillow. By the time the Abbey bells marked noon, rain had returned in a fine grey sheet that blurred the yard beyond the window. The inn had quieted around them. Carters ate in the common room. Stable boys shouted once, then fell silent. The surgeon's apprentice came to peer at Hale's leg and left after Catherine made him repeat dosage times back to her correctly. The Duke remained in the same position near the door or the window, changing place without sound, never leaving the threshold for longer than a minute. When a messenger in Renford livery arrived, the Duke took the note, read it, burned it in the grate, and said only, "Again." Catherine noticed because she noticed everything that might later matter in court or sickroom. She also noticed that each time she pushed herself up from the chair, the Duke's hand tightened once against whatever surface was nearest, then released when she sat again. Hale slept, woke, drank, slept, his colour improved by shades. Catherine's own composure thinned by threads. She had been wet, cold, hungry and alert since before dawn. Adrenaline had carried her through the lane, the setting, the argument with the surgeon, the shame of Lady Norwood's message delivered aloud. That force was gone now. In its place came shivering she could not fully suppress and a deep ache in her bones that made even holding the cup feel laborious. She set the cup down too quickly. It knocked against the saucer and rattled. The Duke looked over at once. "Enough!" She lifted her chin. "Enough what, Your Grace? Enough proving you can stand longer than pain." Heat flared under her skin, defensive and sharp. "No one has ever rewarded me for doing less." "Then your employers were fools?" "My employer is a lady with legal authority." "Temporary legal authority," he said, "and increasingly poor paper." The room seemed to narrow. She turned toward him fully. "What did you say?" He did not answer at once. He crossed to the hearth, picked up the poker, settled a fallen coal, and set the poker back with exact alignment on the brass rest. He moved like a man who trusted control more than comfort. "I said what I chose to say," he replied. "You may infer the rest." Her pulse beat high in her throat. She thought of the copied codicil hidden under attic slats. She thought of signatures traced by candle smoke until her eyes burned. She thought of Lady Norwood's voice saying, "Burn it. There is no use preserving fantasies." "You have no right to examine my family papers," she said. "I did not examine your family papers." "Then how do you know anything of legal authority?" His gaze held hers, storm-grey and unblinking. "Because men who forge leverage generally repeat themselves. In business, in estates, in marriage contracts, patterns are legible." It was not a confession. It was not denial. It was information placed between them with deliberate weight. Catherine felt the ground of the conversation shift beneath her feet, dangerous and oddly steady at once. From the table, Hale made a weak sound. She rose immediately, but the Duke reached the bedside first and put one hand lightly at his steward's shoulder. "Easy," he said. The single word altered Hale's breathing faster than any tincture. The Duke adjusted the pillow by fractions she recognised as practised care disguised as efficiency. Hale settled again, eyes closing, and the Duke withdrew his hand as if he had touched fire. Catherine saw the movement. So did the maid in the doorway, who looked down at once and pretended interest in a fold of linen. No one spoke for a long minute. Then Catherine said quieter, "You should have your temple cleaned again. The swelling has deepened." "I am aware. You may lose consciousness later if you ignore it." "I will not ignore it. You are ignoring it now." His mouth hardened. "Attend your own condition." "My condition is none of your concern." He stepped closer, stopping at the edge of propriety and not crossing it. "Your left cuff carries 3-day-old bruising at the wrist. Your right forearm has a fresh mark shaped like finger pressure. Your heel bled through your stocking an hour ago. You flinch when footsteps in Norwood livery enter a corridor. You ration food to the injured and call it discipline. You do not sit until ordered because you expect punishment for resting." Each sentence landed with brutal precision. No raised voice, no ornament, a diagnosis, cold and exact. Catherine felt stripped without a hand touching her. "You presume too much," she whispered. "Do I?" It was not a question. It was a verdict he already trusted. She looked away first, because if she held his gaze she might say something reckless and truth in the wrong room had wrecked lives before. In the silence the fire settled with a soft collapse of ash. Outside, wheels passed through wet gravel. Somewhere below, glass shattered, and a man cursed, then apologized. Ordinary sounds of an inn-morning. Ordinary life moving while this room remained suspended. The Duke spoke again, voice lower. "You will not return to Norwood House today." Her head snapped back toward him. "I must." "No." "She threatened to clear my room." "Then your room is no longer relevant. She can sell what remains of my father's effects." "Most were sold months ago." The cruelty of accuracy hit like cold water. She swallowed hard. "How would you know that?" "I know what leaves auction rooms in this county." His jaw tightened. "I know which lots were listed under deceased physician's estate and purchased through intermediaries attached to one household. I know the walnut desk has not yet been resold." Her heart hammered once, hard enough to hurt. "Where is it?" "At my winter house." He held her gaze and did not soften the line that could not be unsaid. "I bought it before the third bidder could." She stared at him, unable to shape reply fast enough. Her father's desk, the ink burn on the right corner, the shallow scratch where Catherine, age 11, had tried to carve an initial and been too frightened to finish. Gone from Norwood, not destroyed, not lost to strangers, in his possession. "Why?" she said, and the word came out thinner than she intended. He did not answer at once. He looked toward Hale, then back to her, and in that measured pause she understood the discipline in him was not absence of feeling, but its barricade. "Because it was yours," he said. The sentence split something open inside her, clean and terrifying. Not rescue, not romance. Recognition, acted upon with resources she had never commanded and had stopped imagining anyone would spend on her behalf. She pressed her fingertips against the chair back until sensation returned. "You had no claim. Neither did the man who bid against me." "That is not what I meant." "I know." Again plain. Again unbearable. A footman appeared with another sealed note, this one bearing Renford Arms. He bowed and held it toward the Duke. "From Renford House, Your Grace. The nursery reports the boy has taken broth and kept it." For the first time since dawn, the Duke's face changed in a way no title could command. Not relief exactly. Something more guarded and more human. His shoulders dropped by the width of a breath. "Good," he said. He broke the seal, read, then passed the note to Catherine without preamble. The script was brisk, likely a housekeeper's hand. Fever reduced, sleep intermittent, asking for the lady with the dark braid who told the harbour story. Catherine read the line twice. "He remembers." "He asked for you earlier today as well," the Duke said. "I did not send for you then." "Why not?" "You were in no state to travel, and because I wanted to see if he would ask again when clearer." And he did. He did. He took the note back and folded it into his pocket. You will come to Renford House when Hale can be moved, not before. You are useful here. Useful. The word should have stung. In his mouth it did not mean expendable. It meant necessary. Hale stirred again, whispered for water, then sank. Catherine moved to the table automatically. The Duke moved at the same instant. Their shoulders brushed in the narrow space between chair and bed, cloth damp against wool, heat startling after a day of cold. Catherine stepped back at once, pulse skittering. The Duke froze, then shifted half a pace away and stood absolutely still until she had room to pass. She gave Hale water, checked the bandage, and found her own hands unsteady again. Not from fatigue this time. From proximity she did not want to name. When Hale slept once more, the Duke drew the armchair nearer the hearth with a scrape of wood on floorboards. He did not look at her while he spoke. "Sleep! I cannot! You can! Here!" He sat. The command was not complete until the second word landed. Here, under his eye, under his name, where Lady Norwood's footman could not drag her by the sleeve and call it propriety. Here, where scandal would attach to him before it reached her. Here, where she could close her eyes without losing what little remained to defend. Catherine stood motionless, every lesson of caution warring with the body's blunt plea for rest. She should refuse. She should insist on returning before punishment multiplied. She should keep distance from ducal protection that could be withdrawn as abruptly as it was offered. Yet he had counted her spoonfuls. He had watched her limp and named it. He had bought a desk no one else would have recognized. He had stood in a corridor for hours and not moved while she worked, as if movement itself might break something fragile and newly forming between duty and trust. She sat on the edge of the chair first, rigid, hands clasped. The fire's warmth reached her at last, slow and undeserved. Her eyes burned. She blinked once, twice. The room softened at the edges. Without meaning to, she leaned. Her shoulder found the heavy line of his upper arm. She tensed, ready to pull back. He did not move, not an inch, not to claim, not to comfort, simply to hold position like stone set against floodwater. Hale breathed evenly on the bed. Rain whispered at the panes. The inn settled into afternoon hush. Catherine told herself she would close her eyes for 1 minute only. Darkness came at once, deep and complete, and when her weight shifted fully against him, the Duke remained as he was, silent and immovable, while the fire burned lower and the bells marked the passing hour. When Catherine woke, the fire had collapsed to red seams and grey ash, and the room held that late-hour hush that came before evening lamps were lit. Her cheek was still against the Duke's sleeve. His shoulder had not shifted. His hand rested on the chair arm exactly where it had been when her eyes closed, fingers rigid, knuckles pale with the strain of stillness. She drew back at once. "Forgive me!" He rose in one controlled movement, as if he had merely stood from a table, not held the weight of another body for hours. Hale slept without panic. Your method worked. Mr. Hale, half awake on the table, managed a dry whisper. His Grace refused to move. I attempted to cough him into discomfort. He ignored me. The Duke looked toward the hearth. Eat again, both of you. We leave within the hour. For Renford House? Catherine asked. For Lansdowne first. A knock sounded. The innkeeper admitted Mr. Pike, hat damp, ledgers under one arm, his clerk behind him with a dispatch box. Catherine had not seen the solicitor in months. He had gone grey at the temples. He bowed to the Duke first, then to her with an unease that looked close to shame. "Miss O'Brien, I should have called sooner." Lady Norwood's sealed note to him seemed to burn again in Catherine's pocket. You received her message this morning." "I did." Mr. Pike set the ledgers on the table and opened the box. "I did not act on it. I brought this instead." He drew out the trust deed, the codicil, and a bank attestation marked with fresh wax. Under better light, the codicil's final page showed what Catherine had traced by candle for years. Ink of a different cast, pressure inconsistent, and a witness signature from a clerk who had died 4 months before the date beside his name. Mr. Pike swallowed. "Your father signed the original transfer. The codicil extending Lady Norwood's full control was added later. I suspected. I did not challenge it in time." He placed a second paper beside the first. "I have given sworn statement to the magistrate. So has the bank manager. So has the auction broker who handled the estate lots." The Duke spoke without looking at him. "And the note Lady Norwood sent today?" Mr. Pike hesitated, then produced it. "She instructed me to remove any record of Miss O'Brien's beneficial claim and to mark her unstable in household annotations. I retain the original. The magistrate has a copy." Catherine set her hand on the ledger edge to steady herself. The years of guessing had become proof in 3 sheets of paper. She thought she would feel triumph. She felt only the sharp, clean shock of not being dismissed. By 7 that evening, rain had thinned to mist over the lamps on Lansdowne Hill, and a constable stood at the Norwood house door beside 2 Renford men, while Catherine climbed the attic stairs she had climbed 1,000 nights in fear. She carried a candle this time. Her hand did not shake. Lady Norwood's voice rose from below, clipped and furious. "You will not invade my household on gossip and theatrics." The constable answered in a level tone, "Madam, this is an order for document seizure and transfer review." In the attic room, the mattress had been pulled half off the frame, but the slat still held. Catherine knelt, lifted the rope edge, and drew out the linen bundle. Her father's notebook, her copied debt schedules, the folded codicil tracing with her margin notes on ink flow and pen pressure, all present. She pressed the notebook once to her chest, then wrapped it again and carried it downstairs. At the second-floor landing she stopped, turned into the old nursery cupboard, and took one more object from the back shelf where she had hidden it years ago, her mother's silver-backed brush with the missing tooth. She did not leave it behind again. In the blue sitting room, Lady Norwood stood in violet silk, despite the hour. Rose-water scent sharp in the close air, Lydia and Anne flanking her with faces gone hard and bright. "So," Lady Norwood said, eyes flicking to the bundle in Catherine's arms, "you have found patrons for your performance." Catherine placed the notebook on the escritoire, opened it to her father's hand, and set her copied pages beside the original deed Mr. Pike had brought. "Not patrons, witnesses." Lady Norwood's gaze moved once to the Duke in the doorway and back to Catherine. "You think standing near rank will wash off what you are?" The Duke answered before Catherine could. "What she is has been plain for years. What you are is now documented." No one raised a hand. No one shouted. The constable took inventory as each ledger, sale receipt, and transfer notice was removed from Lady Norwood's cabinet and sealed in canvas sacks. Lydia began to cry when the clerk tagged the jewellery register. Anne stared at Catherine with a hatred that had nowhere left to act. Neither sister spoke again. The midsummer assembly had already filled when Catherine entered the supper room on the Duke's arm. Candlelight struck crystal and gilt. Silk rustled. Conversations broke apart and fell into a silence so complete she heard the small tick of rain from hems onto polished floor. She wore a dark blue gown from Renford Stores, plain in cut, mended at one cuff where a seam had given. Her hair was braided and pinned without ornament. The room still stared as if she had arrived in a coronet. Lady Norwood stepped from a circle of matrons before the footman could announce anything further. "How efficient!" she said, smiling for the crowd and baring teeth beneath it. "Our dependent disappears by day and returns by night attached to a duke. Shall we call this gratitude or ambition?" Catherine felt the old instinct to lower her gaze. It did not come. The Duke's hand remained at her elbow, steady as a brace. His voice carried to the back wall. "Good! I married her." The words struck the room harder than any shout. A vicar in black, standing near the magistrate's table, lifted the parish register and bowed once, in confirmation. Murmurs ran, surged, died when the magistrate rose. "Silence, if you please." Chairs scraped. No one sat. The magistrate read the findings in measured lines. Fraudulent codicil. Misappropriation of estate assets held in trust. Coercive deprivation of a legal beneficiary. Pending civil penalties. Immediate removal of Lady Norwood from administrative control. Residence to pass back to Miss Catherine O'Brien, now Her Grace the Duchess of Renford by lawful ceremony and recorded entry. Interim supervision for Lady Norwood to be assumed by her brother in Somerset, with restricted access to financial instruments, until further hearing. Lady Norwood went white beneath powder. "This is absurd!" The magistrate did not look up. "This is executed!" When she turned toward Catherine, fury finally stripped refinement from her face. "You ungrateful girl! I fed you!" Catherine's voice was quiet and clear. "You itemized bread as leverage." It was the first time she had answered in that room without apology. The sentence landed and remained. Near midnight, the assembly resumed in fragments around the edges of scandal. But the centre had shifted. Women who had once offered pity now offered curtsies, uncertain and late. Men who had not seen her in years inclined their heads, as if memory had corrected itself under pressure. Catherine accepted none of it as redemption. Witness was not kindness. It was still better than erasure. At Renford House she went first to the nursery before removing her gloves. The boy in the bed, dark curls damp at the temples, fever gone from his skin, pushed himself upright when he saw her. "You came back," he said. "I said I would." He held out a carved wooden boat with one chipped mast. "I kept this for the harbour story." She sat, told the story from the beginning, and watched his breathing stay even through the final line. By the time she tucked the blanket to his chin, his eyes had closed naturally. In the corridor, the Duke waited with one hand on the banister, expression unreadable in low light. "He will recover fully," she said. "Yes." "And Mr. Hale?" "Sleeping, complaining, therefore healing." The next morning, wagons rolled into the courtyard of her father's house with seized furnishings and documented returns. The walnut desk came down, wrapped in blankets. Catherine removed the covering herself and set her palm on the old ink burn at the corner. Real wood, real weight, not memory. Mrs. Davies arrived before noon, with 2 trunks and an apron folded over her arm. "If there is work to be done, I would rather do it where accounts are honest," she said, eyes bright and unsmiling. "There is work," Catherine answered. They opened the old surgery windows. They scrubbed the counters. They sorted jars fit for use from jars fit only for disposal. The father's notebook lay open beside new ledgers in Catherine's hand. By dusk, a brass plate rested on the front table, awaiting the smith's final polish. O'Brien Clinic, for women and children of Bath, no fee refused. When the last worker left, she stood alone in the doorway between waiting room and surgery, and listened to the house breathe around her, without fear in it. The Duke did not cross the threshold until she turned and nodded once. Then he came in, removed his gloves, and set a sealed envelope on the desk. "Harlwick's receipt," he said. "Silver replaced in full. Milliner compensated for the ruined bodies. Mr. Pike's final filing copy, the constable's transfer record. Every loose thread tied in paper and wax. Catherine looked at the stack, then at him. You account for everything. I was raised to account for damage. She studied the scar by his brow, the hand that had trembled once and then steadied, the man who had stood still long enough for her to sleep. And for care? He held her gaze, winter-grey eyes no longer cold, only direct. I am learning. Outside, evening rain began again, soft this time on the stone. Inside, her father's house was warm for the first time in years, and her name at last belonged to her,